Good. So we're going to talk about GPT and large language models, the implications for education and beyond. How many of you have played with ChatGPT or one of the other large language models? So it looks like about 75% of you have done that, all right? And how about thinking deeply, or perhaps even having written already about issues on the ethics law and governance issues related to ChatGPT or another large language models? So I would say that's about 50% of you have done that, maybe even more. So that's all by way of saying, yes, we have a panel here, but we're also recognizing that there may be as much expertise in this audience as there is on our panel, and many of you could have easily been on our panel. So that's by way of our also saying we're going to try and open up this conversation as we move on. So the panelists are largely going to take a role of being fire starters, each taking about 7 minutes or so. We will talk among ourselves. We would appreciate it if, when you bring in questions, you direct them toward the panel, but we're also open to your making statements about topics and so forth that you think are not being given adequate attention. So with that, let me introduce the panelists. They are not going to be introduced in the same order that they are on the website or in your pamphlet. We're going to introduce them in the order that they're going to speak, because we're trying to get the semblance of a narrative going with the way we have these presentations. So we're going to start with a presentation that will be a case study, and by the end we're going to be talking about geopolitics. And in between we'll talk about education and many other topics that are affected by large language models. For those of you who don't know the term, we're also going to talk about generative AI, because ChatGPT and large language models in general all fall within this broader rubric of generative AI, but generative AI also includes tools that don't just work with language. They might work with images, for example, or they might work with even sound bites or code. And we are actually moving into an era now where we have forms of generative AI that are actually working with all of these different modalities simultaneously and giving rise to a new category, which is, as an acronym, is GGLLMM, which is pronounced Golem, which is just a way of saying that some of these models are doing some pretty bizarre things. So with that, I'm going to introduce all of our panelists, but our panelists are going to be doing presentations, so we're going to be going back and forth between the dais here and just viewing what other panelists are presenting. So first off, we're going to have Whitney Dover. She's the founder of the Pollinate legal team at the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law at Arizona State University. And she was formerly a trial lawyer who's now transitioning to being a legal technologist. Whitney will be followed by Jane Bambauer, who's a Dorothy H. and Louis Rosenstiel Distinguished Professor of Law at the University of Arizona College of Law, and her research focus is fundamental problems of well-intended technology policies. She will be followed by Leah Bishop. Leah is a professor of law at Indiana University's Robert H. McKinney School of Law, where her research focus is intellectual property, copyright, and patent law. Then Chitta Baral, am I pronouncing that correctly, Chitta? Good. Chitta Baral is a professor here at the School of Computing and Augmented Intelligence, and he's the lead of the Cognition and Intelligence Lab. Finally, Brad Allenby, the Lincoln Professor of Ethics and Engineering, who's also affiliated with the center, affiliated with many different parts of this university, aren't you? But he is affiliated with the Center for Earth Systems Engineering and Management at Arizona State University. And I'm an active kind of moderator, so I'm actually going to do a few opening comments after all of our other presenters, where I'm going to talk a little bit about governance issues and some governance proposals that are posed by what I will call this chat GPT or generative AI moment, which is forcing us to think more deeply about AI governance. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to you, Whitney.
All right, I don't have quite the support anymore with my esteemed panelists up here, so thank you all for your smiles and kindness from the audience in advance. I'm really grateful to be here, excited for the opportunity to talk about all things Gen AI. And before we get started into the use case discussion that I'm going to cover, I did just want to level set a little bit on terminology. I know that there are a lot of words up here on the screen, and I want to just draw your attention to some of the highlighted components, specifically the very last line on the first component of my good friend Nicola's tweet. I believe it was a LinkedIn post, actually, her LinkedIn post here. Basically what we're talking about when we're talking about generative AI, ChatGPT, is a metamorphosis of AI, machine learning, generative AI, LLMs, GPT, and ChatGPT, which was ultimately built on all of these different foundational blocks. And I think what I also would like to just draw your attention to on the second component here is Nicola's statement that what will change the world we live in inevitably is generative AI and large language models. Not ChatGPT itself, because the chat component of GPT is just the user interface, but the technologies behind these interfaces that are making a big difference. Sorry. Thanks, Josh. Appreciate it. So I was asked to give a brief introduction. Can everyone hear me better now? I was asked to kind of give a brief introduction on what impact some of these technologies were having in the legal space. As Wendell introduced me, I'm a former trial attorney. I started a legal operations and innovation consulting firm about 6 years ago. And for the last 2 years, I've been seconded in-house to a large corporate legal department in the OEM space, Fortune 10 client. And we've had the pleasure of playing with GPT-4, the model that was only released this year. We had premature access to that about 8 months ago. And we've been exploring how we are using that. The interface that is sort of tied with the GPT model is a specific technology product. So really working with the founders of the technology product to build out the user interface and understand how this is changing, how we're practicing law, and how our attorneys are going to be interacting with this particular technology tool. It's worth noting that where we currently sit, AI, so those generative AI models, the LLM models, it can read text, it can summarize text, it can annotate text, it can analyze text, it can translate text, it can categorize text, it can synthesize text, and it can interpret text. I sure hope that after the couple days of this conference, you have been well informed that this is already changing the practice of law. It's not coming, it's here. We've had the pleasure of, as I mentioned, building out a lot of specific use cases for specific legal practice. Some of them with the company we're using, Casetext, their new co-counsel product, are enumerated here. Casetext co-counsel is really the first to market legal technology product that has utilized the GPT 4.0 model, so they've partnered with OpenAI, but has put specific guardrails in place in the system so that it's suitable and appropriate for legal use. What has been really exciting about this technology is because it's so new, we've been able to innovate with this particular team to actually build UI around the technology for specific legal use cases. Generally speaking, a lot of these use cases center around searching databases, summarizing, generating correspondence, generating timelines, reviewing documents. In terms of transactional skills, things like editing contract clauses, contract policy compliance, drafting contracts, extracting data from contracts, and doing market checks for M&A. And in litigation, legal research memos, preparing for depositions, drafting interrogatories and motions, briefing a case, drafting responsive pleadings, analyzing cited authorities, and many, many more use cases. What's really exciting about this particular technology and where we are with it currently is the massive amount of alternative or more general use cases centered around data. We traditionally have been a very data-rich but information-poor industry. Just 10% of data in our industry is considered structured, meaning usable for purposes of business insights. These tools really allow us to access these key business intelligence components from unstructured data now faster, more accurately, and in a method that is enabling us to embed them in risk mitigation, actual on-site legal advice and counsel, and potentially compliance issues that come down the pipeline with our legal department friends. It's also a really interesting opportunity for use cases in terms of access to justice. Co-counsel specifically has been looking at a lot of opportunities for how they can really get into legal aid and help folks who don't have access to justice or where there are currently limited bandwidth or resources. Lots of interesting use cases here. They're helping to build out the UI for a lot of those use cases, and I think the expansion for what this does in terms of access to justice is something we should all take note of and become a part of. So a few key takeaways before I pass it off to some of my other esteemed panelists here. Also, I was told that I would be removed peacefully if I didn't adhere to my 7-minute time limit here. So why is it important that we start thinking about this from a practical perspective? So users of technology should really be creating our toolbox. I think someone on the panel earlier today talked about this. And when we're talking about how we are articulating risk and how we are taking into account the technologies that are currently on the marketplace, it's important to understand that this is already disrupting the roles of lawyers. This technology is here, it matters. There's definitely a safe way to use it. There's definitely an unsafe way to use it. And the technology is really replacing tasks, not people. I think that there's a lot of fear still in the industry. I know Gary talked about it in his chat just a few minutes ago. But a lot of lawyers are afraid. And so when we're thinking about implementation of this technology, it's imperative that we really focus on the replacement of tasks and bringing our industry from information processing and gathering, where we have spent a lot of time, into more of that advocacy and counsel, which is really what we're trained to do. This really results in a need for a change in legal education, which is the topic of our talk today, and both for law students, but also for current practitioners. I think a component that is often left out. Things like prompt engineering, things like how we are vetting technology, and things like how we are implementing and deploying technology. So with that, I'll pass it off to my next panelists so they can do their introductory remarks.
Thank you. Great. Okay, so one reason lawyers and doctors too are regulated and so well compensated is that we provide guidance and skilled provision of information. And for law and especially legal education, it's almost all we do is well-timed, and well-selected information. And so it makes sense that a lot of us might feel some amount of anxiety right now, especially because a couple of weeks ago, OpenAI researchers claimed that we are the 5th most exposed industry. Exposed, of course, doesn't mean replaced. I agree that we will have some certain tasks replaced, but that we will still need to do a lot of managing, and we will still require a bunch of skills to do good law and practice good medicine. But it's a good time to think about what that skill set is, because so much of our mental bandwidth, both in terms of training lawyers, future lawyers, but also in the practice of law itself, has been about basically context-dependent search and good writing. And both of those things are going to become much easier. So what I thought I would do is figure out, kind of organize thoughts that I'm sure all of us have had, but try to organize them into what is AI, especially large language models, but not exclusively. What is it good at and likely to be good at for the near future? What are its incompetencies still? What can we infer about which lawyers will be able to benefit the most and add value the most? And then from there, we can reverse engineer how to train the future lawyers. Okay, so first of all, Obviously, I think it's straightforward that summarizing cases, precedent, and rules, and describing standard treatment options, if we're thinking about not doctors especially, but maybe legal guidance as well, is going to become pretty good at a sort of baseline level of competence. Matching new facts to a previous literature, which is a way of talking about diagnosis in the medical field, issue spotting in the legal field, that's going to be able to be outsourced to AI. I do want to say I am talking about AI a little more generally than just large language models, because I do think that, especially in medicine, but maybe elsewhere as well, the combination of sensors and machine learning is also going to be doing a lot of this organizing, recognizing, recognizing certain types of, radiology treatments that would be appropriate and whatnot. And that really doesn't fall squarely within LLMs. And maybe the better way to put it is that, yes, we can learn a lot from what others have said before, but that's not the only input data that matters for the legal profession or especially for medicine. So, but in any case, large language models though have really caught our attention because they are so good already. Okay, so matching, communicating. I have found that GPT-4 and Bard as well, to some extent, is even better than I am at pitching language to different types of readership levels, and GPT, ChatGPT at least, can even meet the high standards of what a judge would be expecting the quality of the writing to be in a memo or whatnot. And so content, may be lacking, but in terms of communication, these LLMs are quite good. And then there is more and more evidence that with careful construction of prompts, LLMs can also be very useful for discovering new lines of inquiry, identifying gaps in the literature, and doing the sorts of things that just go a little bit beyond simply synthesizing and summarizing, although it does require, at least right now, a skilled human guide. Okay, so what's it bad at? This is where we get hopeful, right? Hallucination, so immodest gap filling is the best way I can put it. I think we've all encountered times where GPT-4, and by the way, Bard does this too, just makes stuff up, including entire citations that are false. And this problem, as far as I understand at least, is not going to go away, because even if the companies get better at solving these problems, there are also a range of prompt injection attacks that will start to, right now it's not a big issue, but as these tools become more and more used, we're going to see attacks on these systems so that they provide false information. So I think at least for the medium future, bad information will come out of these at least occasionally. And here's the big one: goal setting, right? So not only is an AI not good at understanding a particular client's goals, but also the sort of social goals and priorities have to be set. And we don't agree. I mean, if we all agreed on exactly how to make trade-offs, then maybe we could feed our sort of first order and second order preferences to an AI and just have it regulate everything for us, but we won't agree on those social priorities. And so constructing arguments where we already know that in a process of negotiation, lawmaking, or a hard case, people won't agree, those cases will continue to be hard, and we will need to make arguments that appeal to values. And then finally, humans have an advantage over machines because we are not machines, and that matters to other humans. And so robophobia is a term that my colleague Andrew Woods talks about, but the idea is there is some bias against machines even when they are more accurate. People also talk about AI being less explainable than a human decision maker. I put an asterisk because, the brain is also a black box, and the explanations we tell ourselves are not always even true. And so, I'm not sure how those two actually compare head to head, but in any case, these are things that maybe humans have an advantage over. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, clearly the quality of service is going to go up. So the minimum and, average quality of service for professionals, doctors or lawyers, I'm especially thinking about lawyers, is going to go up. The quantity, I am not sure. So it could be that with greater productivity and quality, the demand for services goes up. That is perfectly plausible. We could wind up with needing to train more lawyers than ever before. Or it could be more of a replacement over time. And so, but also I think the distribution of the value that lawyers add is going to be more skewed. And so it has this sort of thicker tail where, at the top, say, quintile of lawyers are going to add a lot of value by leveraging these tools. And I don't mean to suggest that this is a simple shift, like the lawyers who are good today will become even better tomorrow. There may be, the lawyers that are especially prized today may be really, really good at searching and synthesizing material, and that's the skill that's going to be replaced. Whereas the policy arguments, I'm done with my time. Okay, whereas the policy arguments are going to be more critical. So going through this quickly now, how does this shake out? If we went through everything that I described, I think you'd see that humans will still be able to compete with each other, essentially, be more skilled than alternative lawyers when they have a certain amount of paranoia to make sure that what they're saying is correct, when they have a facility with philosophy, economics, and politics to make good policy arguments. And so here are some of the implications that I think are tentative, but that suggest that how we train lawyers, we might want to put more emphasis on actually studying economics, philosophy, and politics. Okay, I'm out of time. Gotta go.
Which one's the first? This one. Is that one the first? Yes. Okay, I'm Leah Bishop. Let me just preview. Oh, no. These are the wrong slides. No, it's okay. It's just these are the slides I prepared as a demonstration of what AI could do for me in 3 minutes. So those are not the slides that I'm speaking from. I spent a bit more time preparing my slides for you, and I hope you will feel that there was a value add, but I would invite you at the end to compare, and you can see them at tinyurl.com/tome slides, T-O-M-E, that's the name of the program, Tome Slides. All right, let's do a real presentation. My name is Leah Bishop. The governance issue that I want to talk today is about something very relevant to all of us as scholars, what journal policies should be toward AI-generated, assisted, supported text within journal publications, right? Should we as scholars be using it? And to get to that question, I'm going to start from my area of expertise, which is copyright law, which has been doing deep thinking about questions of authorship and originality and creativity for more than 100 years. And if 7 minutes turns out to be enough, I hope to persuade you that Holden Thorpe is the most dangerous man in science. Where do we stand on this already? Who's read Holden Thorpe's editorial, knows who he is? It's a mixed audience. Lawyers don't know who he is. I heard from a PhD, apparently this guy is pretty important. There's this magazine called Science with a high impact factor, and he's the editor-in-chief. And so when he writes a 2 or 3 page editorial about whether ChatGPT should be used in publishing, 100,000 people download it, and 200 people have already cited it, and he only published it in January. So let's go to that copyright insight first. Raise your hand if you saw that movie where there was a giant asteroid and it was about to hit Earth and everybody was freaking out. It was going to end life as we know it. The government couldn't solve the problem, but this ragtag band of heroes was able. You guys don't get out enough. Okay, no. All right. There are a lot of hands. Shout it out. What's the name of the movie I'm talking about? You guys did not all say the same thing, right? And the thing is that Hollywood has done this over and over, right? This is not an original premise. It's not an original idea. They have done it in at least this many titles. And so how is it that at a matter of copyright law, directors can get away with this, right? They're copying quite a bit, and yet they're not in trouble. And the answer is copyright law recognizes something called the distinction between protected expression and unprotectable ideas. These things will be mixed together within a single book or a single slideshow, but the law is going to later force us to distinguish between them so that we can decide whether somebody copied something okay or did the wrong kind of copying. All right, lawyers in the audience are going to expect me to quote the United States Code here. I used to make my students interpret this sentence by sentence. They call that statute torture. Okay, we're not going to do that today. Now my students and I start with rough drafts from ChatGPT, and then I explain what ChatGPT got wrong and where we need to add nuance. All right, so here are 2 ways of expressing the idea expression difference. And these 2 expressions were both composed by ChatGPT in response to, I think my prompt said, summarize copyright law's distinction between ideas and expression. Now, I hit generate a couple of times, right? There were 8 and these 2 were the best, right? But it didn't take me that long to review 8 and choose the best. I would have agonized over language like that for an hour. Am I the only one? Only one? Okay. All right. So this is a slide that I did agonize over the language, and ChatGPT helped me. We worked together, and I changed and changed and changed. And here's what I think the statute boils down to. Section 102. It has an A and a B. A says everything is protected by copyright, and B says not everything is protected. So here's what it means. All the nuance is in here. A, all types of creative expression are protected by copyright and protected automatically as soon as you record your creativity. Not everything within those creations is protected. So for example, if you write a book, people can help themselves to the ideas, information, facts, words, phrases, instructions, methods, format, structures, premises, situations, traditions, conventions inside that book. And we take that whole bunch of things that are okay and good to copy, and we call them the ideas, in opposition to what is bad to copy, and we call that the expression. So this may be a shocker to some of us. Copyright law does not protect your ideas, and it is not a violation of copyright law for somebody to steal your idea and fail to give you credit. That is plagiarism, and it's not the same thing. All right. Here's an idea. I asked ChatGPT to explain it. It came up with that. It wrote an essay in like 30 seconds. Here, this is cooler because this is something that I could not have done no matter how much time I spent. I was able to use DALL-E to come up with some artistic expressions of this idea about the evolution of writing technology. And this is maybe my favorite one. I had ChatGPT help me generate a dialogue between Data and Picard about this. You'll have to take my word that it's funny. So what I want to point out is that we do a lot of different things, and it is way too simplistic to call it generating text. All right, so as journal policies, when Holden Thorpe says it's worrisome that artificial text could find its way into the literature, I find that a very naive concern, because it was never the text that mattered. What we care about as scholars is the ideas, not the particular expression. We want new ideas, new insights, new systems, originality of ideas. The expression is just the wrapping paper that we put around it. And this seems to me to be fetishizing the expression, the wording. And I better stop there. Thank you.
How do I change it? Okay. Okay, hello, good afternoon. So I'm a professor in computer science, so I have a slightly different take. We actually build such systems like GPT or working on improving it. So when you're building and trying to improve, that means you find faults in it. So I am amazed by a lot of things that it does, but my focus is like what it doesn't do right, and how do we go about fixing it. So that's the slant I will be taking here. So as I said, in AI, from the early stages of artificial intelligence, people have been enamored to try to build chatbots, try to build systems that can communicate with people. And currently, they are improving at a very fast pace, but challenges remain. I'll give, it was mentioned, the hallucination was mentioned before, and there are a couple of others. I mean, for people here, legal minds, I'm sure you want it that it should do proper reasoning. The reasoning should be right. There is also interesting aspects that when prompted knowledge is overshadowed by training corpus. So if you train your system saying everybody loves hot soup, and then you ask a question about cold soup, somebody liking a cold soup, after seeing thousands or millions of articles about hot soup, the question about cold soup gets confused. Common sense reasoning, many times common sense reasoning are not written down well. So that's kind of issues like everybody knows kind of thing, or many of the common sense aspects. So it's not written, not so the training doesn't happen as well. So there are many issues with common sense reasoning. Then there are, if there are any computer science people, there are tasks or reasoning tasks which are like NP complete and beyond. That means which are, we don't know even have a polynomial time way of reasoning it. It might go exponential, like planning is a good example. So there, these systems falter because in the text what it is trained on, there are not that kind of reasoning happening. Reasonings are kind of simple linear chains or fairly simple. If you train it with mathematical proofs, there may be a little more, but not the kind where you need to do AI planning. So I had a slide, but I think with the time about the technology behind it, so probably I'll go with one bullet. The key technology behind it is the conditional probability, calculating or computing the conditional probability of a word given a sequence of previous words. Okay? And this n here, W1 to Wn, means if you go to the last bullet, last but one bullet, GPT-3 allows 2048 tokens, GPT 3.5, 4096 tokens. That means for that much input, what would be the next word? And of course, that would be like even for 10, a size of 10 input, the number of combinations 10 to the 50. This is like way, so we're not way beyond. So we're not going to really compute it, so we take neural networks to approximate this computation of this probability. And so that approximation is there, and this is the key component of language models. And large language models, basically the large comes in that the corpus it is trained on is extremely large. So it's able to do a little better approximation. So that's kind of the technology behind it. So hallucination, the easiest example, actually I had a recommendation at the end, I think. I asked write my biography. It gave me all kinds of awards. It gave me PhD from Amherst. I did PhD in Maryland, all kinds of things. This is another one. It's the same thing, actually, I asked again. Now it said I was born in Dhaka, Bangladesh. I'm from India. So all kinds of things, all the things in the red are made up stuff. So So reasoning, this shows actually how it is improving. I don't know if you can read the top one. So we're trying to do a slightly convoluted thing, say like if A implies B and you have not B, can you conclude not A? So, and say if Katie had finished all her homework, she could have gone to the party. She didn't go to the party. Did she finish all her homework? I said, no. So this is the GPT-3 version. But actually, the chat GPT version below answers correctly. So it's showing that some of the reasoning is improving. And so what we are working on, this is a research issues, we are looking at various logical reasoning axioms and try to test them, which ones are working, which one are not, and trying to improve on it. And actually, I'll make a pitch here. You legal minds, when you're working, if you face problems with ChatGPT, please get in touch. I would love to collect more and figure out ways to fix them. So this is the soup is cold example. It gets completely confused. If the soup is cold, Bob will like it while eating. He did not like the soup while eating it. Does this mean the soup is not cold? And gives a long-winded explanations about it with the wrong answer. And this is an example from Yejin Choi's TED Talk. She's a computer science professor at University of Washington and a MacArthur Award winner. So say, what would happen if I ride my bike on a bridge that goes over a junkyard with nails and other pointed objects? So it doesn't get the sense that if you're on the bridge, it doesn't matter what is below it. One would say that maybe the nail would come from down below to the bridge, but it doesn't understand that part. So this is the common sense part. And I tried examples similarly with respect to crocodiles, like riding on a bridge over a river, and the river has crocodiles, and like, no, don't do that. The crocodiles are dangerous. So this is another example. Oren Etchioni, who was the CEO of Allen AI, was trying. So imagine an infinitely wide doorway. What is more likely to fit through it, a military tank or a car? So most of the systems actually failed. This is the best one. This is the best one, actually, the Bard answered, but it's still wrong. It gets partly, like in the bottom part, it says there are other factors, but all these systems, they miss that it's not just necessarily just the width, but of course the height and other aspects we should worry about. And that doesn't come to most of the language models. They are not able to get that aspect. How much time I have? 1 minute, oh, perfect. So that's kind of my take. So I should go back to the first slide. And what we are second slide, we computer scientists who deal with this, we try to find faults. It's really one has to be extremely careful using it. If you are not an expert on the topic and you look at the output, it'll look very good. So you need to use it as an aid, and so that you can figure out the mistakes. So it's like you have a you can think of extremely smart assistant who has read a lot of things, and you ask them to write the first draft, but you are the boss, and you are going to read it again and make sure things are right. Thank you.
Just go up and down on this. Yeah. All right. Okay, so I'm going to talk about geopolitics and generative AI in 7 minutes. I want to point out at the beginning a couple of fundamental facts. The first is that the threat to the individual cognitive process, your psychology, from the combination of generative AI with existing adversarial relationships at the geopolitical level means that the fundamental assumption of many pluralistic societies, that is, that the individual and the individual citizen are somehow privileged as decision makers, that day is gone. Up to you as to what you choose to substitute for it. Now, interestingly enough, a lot of the big players have felt the same way. There's a sense of chaos that is very real in a lot of the recent interesting geopolitical statements. This comes out of the very infamous Russia-China joint statement. a transformation of the global governance architecture and world order, redistribution of power. It all sounds really wonderful if you're Russia and China, but the intelligence and security community in the United States feels much the same way. Actors at every level are struggling to agree on new models for how to structure civilization. That's a pretty interesting public statement by the NSA and the CIA. How to structure civilization? There is a distinct pattern in the last year or two in many of these statements of fear that there's a complete loss of control. This is just, many of you have seen this, this is staggering. What's interesting is, if you're in the US Senate and you look at this, your idea is, well, let's take 6 months or a year and come up with some sort of regulatory structure. Never let it be said that fantasy was limited to 2-year-olds. Where this begins to come into play is in things like weaponized narratives. Yuval Harari points out in commentary in The Economist that this particular kind of AI is particularly potent. And it's potent because it speaks language the way we do. It gets into our brain in ways that other technologies don't. Clean meat from factories, could that have a significant impact? Of course. Health span extension, obviously. But none of the existing emerging technologies get into our mind and our psychology the way that this does. If you're running security operations for any country in the world today that has any pretense to world power, this has got to worry you, because what this means is that everything you thought you knew is becoming unstable. Now, I want to continue by pointing out a little bit about the competition between China and the United States, because this is what I get asked. Both countries are failing miserably because both of them are making the same assumption. Both of them are assuming that they're operating in a simple system when, in fact, they are operating in a highly complex adaptive system, and their choice of tools to try to operate in that space is not just suboptimal but dysfunctional. Take the Americans first. Like the Europeans, the Americans never saw a problem that they didn't understand without wanting to regulate it. So that's what the US Senate is talking about. But think about regulation. For regulation to work, it's got to be a simple system in the sense that if you have an input, you know what the output's going to be. If I want to ban asbestos in buildings, the output is less asbestos in buildings. Turns out that was more complicated than they thought, but you get the point. That's a simple system. There is no person on this planet that knows what would happen if the Senate decided to come up with some kind of regulation of ChatGPT, or more broadly, generative AI. Nobody. It's not a simple system. You can't tell me any regulatory input and tell me what the output is going to be with any certainty whatsoever. What does that mean? It's a category mistake. The Americans are saying, this is a simple system and I'm going to regulate it, ignoring the fact that if it is not a simple system, you can't regulate it because you can't predict the output. So, advantage to China? No, because the Chinese are making another mistake, which is exactly equivalent. The Chinese are saying, we have to have control. Xi Jinping is all about control. What's the problem? The problem is the chances of China being able to a priori control generative AI are just as high as the chances the Americans are going to get regulation right, because they're making the same basic assumption. They're assuming they're operating in a simple system. They're both wrong. Right now, the policy of the major powers on this planet towards generative AI is essentially, God, I hope my competitor is more incompetent than I am. History teaches us that that is not a great strategy. So, All right, wise guy, what would you do? Well, the first thing I do is recognize that you're not dealing in just a state-based system. You're dealing in a highly complex, evolving political structure in which the high technology companies have become, by virtue of ChatGPT, but also because of the last 10 years of history, major power centers in their own right. The structure that is likely to evolve, if it is going to be successful, is going to have to be a dynamic network rather than the kind of state-centric system that all of us are assuming. Most of us are lawyers of one kind or another, so we assume a legal structure, a state-based system. It's not the case anymore. It just isn't. Get over it. The second problem is that the structure that they are assuming emphasizes the knowledge that we not only don't have, but we can never have. Nobody knows where this is going. That means that what you need are very different kinds of approaches. So what would I do? The first thing I would do is I would set up an informal network within the government, including people from the high-tech companies, including people from civic society, definitely including the military and security folks, and its only purpose would be to perceive what is actually happening today. Because if you've listened to all of these talks, you've learned things that you didn't know before. This happened, that happened, this was a recent decision. Nobody knows what is going on today on the ground because it's too complex, because you had that 100 million user group. So because you don't know, your first challenge is to perceive what the heck is going on. And that's what we need to do. So who's winning? Nobody. We live in the first chapter of a science fiction novel. And frankly, the way we're screwing it up, we all wear red jackets. Thank you.
So enough of this complexity, Brad. Who's going to win the race between China and the US over generative AI in the next 20 years?
Microsoft.
Microsoft, okay, good. That's actually an interesting question to me. About 2 months ago, I got approached around the time that there was the call for a moratorium by the Future of Life Institute, a 6-month moratorium, and a reporter for Newsweek contacted me and a bunch of other people and asked me what we thought about that moratorium and how it would have, and what it would mean in terms of the AI arms race between China and the US. And I tried to give a more nuanced response and diffuse what I knew would be the knee-jerk reaction. So the article finally came out. As you might expect, most of the respondents said it's a bad idea because it's going to give China an advantage. And we don't want to have a moratorium that could give them an advantage. And of course, my more nuanced expression was the last thing in the article, after we had many other people talk about giving China an advantage in anything. And as I think most of you know, that's one of the main geopolitical arguments getting in the way of considering any kind of governance of AI or any kind of constraint on AI in the United States. My more nuanced answer sort of ended with the Chinese don't really care about these micro moves. They're in the long game, as they always have been. So in any case, that was an opinion on that. Oh, Gary pointed out to me that I didn't introduce myself. So those of you who don't know who I am, I'm Wendell Wallach. And for the last 20 years, I've been very active in this world of the governance and ethics of emerging technologies. including many papers that Gary and I have written together and have been referenced by Adam Tier and others at this conference. So being in that space, I've been very active over this, what shall I say, generative AI moment, because all the debate around the benefits and risks and undesirable societal consequences has actually revived discussion around governance, as you have seen throughout this conference. And that conversation more or less died throughout the period of COVID. But I want to start with just asking you a couple questions. First of all, given the mission of universities to educate students, will large language models improve our ability to fulfill that goal, or will they make education more difficult? So who thinks it's going to improve our ability to educate? And who thinks it's going to weaken our ability to educate? And so the improve actually was stronger than the weaken, which was sort of surprising to me because I ask these questions at different presentations and usually it goes the other way around. Here's another question. Over the next 10 years, so we're just talking about a decade here, will the benefits of generative AI outweigh the risks and undesired societal consequences, or vice versa? So who thinks that the benefits will prevail? And who thinks that the risks are going to be greater than the benefits? So this was, and who sits on the, what should I say, on the cliff of this one? Well, it could go either way. Oh, well, the cliffhangers are clearly winning this particular question. Well, I've been asking that question also in different forms over many years, and it really depends on who the audience is, what the response is. It truly varies from one to another. I asked that question just a few weeks ago at a conference in the Netherlands, Re-Aim, on the use of AI in the military, and the negative consequences won out in terms of the overall impact of AI in that particular setting. So this generative AI is, some people refer to it as the second seminal revolution in the development of artificial intelligence, the first being the deep learning, machine learning revolution that happened basically 7 to 8 years ago, depending on how you look at it. At that time, there was a great deal of discussion around existential risks and whether we should have some governance of AI, but it petered out a little bit as other things came to the fore. And that becomes a question of whether the same thing is going to happen now. Will it peter out? But what we have seen in article after article has been the highlighting of benefits and the highlighting of risks and stupidity that are produced by generative AI, how it is opening the door to both misuse and abuse, deep fakes, all kinds of societal problematics that may exacerbate what we've been seeing since social media in terms of undermining our society. So that brings up this question of, well, what should we be doing from the governance side? How many of you listened to the Senate hearings on Tuesday from the Judiciary Committee that were chaired by Senator Blumenthal? And how many of you read about those hearings? Good, good. Well, I found those to be among the most fascinating Senate hearings I've ever seen. All kinds of strange things took place there. For example, Senator Durbin said, after both the OpenAI and the IBM representative, by the way, the three people who appeared before the panel were Sam Altman, OpenAI CEO, Christina Montgomery, an executive at IBM, and Gary Marcus, who started a small AI company that he sold, but he's kind of been the gadfly criticizing the large corporations and what's going on in the governance sphere. Anyways, Senator Dick Durbin said, "This is a strange hearing to me. In all my years in the Senate, I have never heard corporations ask us to regulate them, because both OpenAI and IBM called for that. Now, whether they were being disingenuous or not, there's a discussion to be had there, but that was fascinating. He said, in all my years in the Senate, every corporation comes and says, lower the regulations on us. So that opened for an interesting moment. Another interesting moment for me was that there were senators who I find very discomforting people in terms of what their values are, asking some brilliant questions. So I think this sort of illuminated the fact that at least there is a shared moment that something should be done, but whether for ideological or legal reasons that got discussed in the plenary panel yesterday, anything can be done, that's a totally different question. I have made a proposal that it's largely been done in more quiet circles or policy circles. But one of the questions that was posed to CEO Sam Altman was whether or not Section 230 applied to generative AI. And he said, no, it doesn't. For those of you who don't know what Section 230 is, that's the safe harbor clause going back to 1996 that has given a platform some relief from various forms of liability. I think when he said it did not apply, I'm pretty sure that there were at least 7 or 8 lawyers at Microsoft and Google who had heart attacks. But I might be wrong about that. I have no empirical evidence on that particular thing. But the point here is that the liability question as posed by Section 230 is going to be reopened. And we have had calls for reopening those from both sides of the ideological aisle in the United States for very different reasons. And I think that offers us the opportunity to use both a carrot and stick approach in holding the AI oligopoly's feet to the fire. And my proposal is, well, how liability might change will depend on whether they can live up to their promise that they can put effective technological guardrails in place. So we say, we're going to give you 6 months. This is not a moratorium. You got 6 months to come up with your promise that you can put effective guardrails in place. You've been promising us that for years with social media, and we still haven't seen it. So let's see whether you can do it here. And if you can do it, we will actually waive antitrust for you to work together on the development of such safeguards. Now, I know this is a pretty crude proposal and there's all kinds of problems, but the point here is let's use this moment as a way of seeing if we can encourage the corporations to actually live up to their promise and stop saying you can trust us, everything's going to be okay. Because I think there's a lot of reasons why we shouldn't be trusting them, particularly if we don't have any regulations in place. So that's a proposal. Some of you might like it or not like it. Another thing that I have been working on, and here I'm just going to ask you for your help, is I've been working for years on the question of whether we can put in place international governance of emerging technologies. And the governance coordinating committees that Gary and I had proposed years ago, we converted that in one paper into global governance coordinating committees, a name that everybody in international affairs hated, but that's beside the point. And we did some work into trying to see whether we could affect discussion around that kind of governance. Well, we have this moment, and I'm trying to do the same thing. We have started an initiative, and we will have some high-level brainstorming meetings at UNESCO and the ITU in the end of June, and they'll be followed by other meetings. But the basic agenda is, are there soft law functions that global governance could fulfill? Acknowledging that the states are not going to allow any hard law on an international level at this time, because the states do not want to see anyone have power of enforcement. So here's where I'm asking you for help. At our meetings, we're going to address 2 agendas. Can we come up with a list of 12 soft law functions that could be filled internationally and need to be filled internationally? And then secondly, we have the kind of people gathered who can think through, well, how might we be able to move that through international circles given present geopolitical affairs? So my ask of you is that any of you who have a thought on a soft law international governance function that could be fulfilled, that you just send that to me. And if it's written up or you see it, you've written a paper on it or something, just send me the reference to that. And that's to wendell.wallach@yale.edu. So with that, let's turn to our panel. And let's talk about what came up in a couple of your comments, was this question of jobs being lost. So do you all think that generative AI is going to destroy more jobs than it creates? So I see people shaking their heads. So Jane, why don't you weigh in first?
Well, I think I explicitly said it's not clear because with higher quality service at a lower price, demand for those services will increase. So I don't think it's clear right now.
Yeah, I actually think quite the opposite is going to occur, specifically if we think about implementation of new technology and the inevitable J-curve that occurs. We will get worse before we get better, and getting worse always means more opportunities for legal implications and risk. I also think that we can't know what we don't know, much to Brad's point in his presentation, and I think that there'll be an entirely new field of jobs that open up with the rise of this technology, not to mention the expansion of current data privacy and data disclosure issues that we're already facing. So I think quite the opposite. I think this is going to create more jobs, especially in the near term.
So a lot of people do underscore this fact that there's definitely going to be new jobs opening up. And nearly all of the analyses that have been done over the years have said that there will be this creation of new jobs. But most of those analyses seem to say that that's going to serve certain segments of the society, but not serve other segments. So what's your thought on that?
That's what I was going to say. I agree with that.
Chitta, you agree with that?
I wanted to make one more point, which was not one more related point, is currently I think the general thinking seems to be that these large language models are kind of like big companies make it. So they are open source, so the Llama, the Facebook one is open source, and many people are taking it and building on top of it. So it's going to be like in our lab, we are making a couple of them for different purposes. And we'll be making more, and many other people, and there will be like somebody in the legal community will take the Llama and train it on the legal documents. Then, so those things are going to happen. So there's going to be a lot of ramifications of this aspect. So it's not just it's Google, Microsoft, and Facebook, and OpenAI making it. Thousands and hundreds of thousands of different versions will come up. So one need to be aware of that.
Anybody else want to weigh in?
I want to take seriously your point about complex systems, right, where we can get unpredictable results. And that if we try to think deductively, when I do this, there are more jobs. We may hit curveballs, not get what we expect. And I wonder if a correction for that is to think by analogy from prior observation, so from history, right? If we analogize this moment of AI transformation as being like the introduction of electricity or industrialization. 100 years later, were there more jobs or fewer jobs because of electricity and industrialization? Or did the concept of what a job is change so much as to make the question a foolish one?
I mean,
Yeah, sorry, go ahead. I think that's a good point, because we tend to make statements like there'll be more jobs, but all of these are time sensitive. I mean, if you look at the introduction of printing into Western Europe, it enabled the Reformation and thereby enabled 150 years of the most brutal religious warfare Europe has ever seen. And now, of course, we think printing is great, except now it's obsolete because we don't read books anymore. But what's interesting is, with jobs, when are you going to draw the line and say, okay, here's where we're going to evaluate the jobs? I think the really critical thing is that the kind of mentality people are going to need in this kind of world is not the one we usually train for. We usually train for disciplines, and I think that's obsolete. We've got to train more for agility and adaptability. Sure, you need basic standard competencies. You need to be good at quant. You need to be good at thinking. You need to be good at organizing. But the reality is, a lot of what I was teaching last semester, I stopped teaching because what I was teaching is engineering students how to communicate, and they don't need to communicate anymore. And that's pretty interesting because it changes a lot of what it is we think we're teaching. I think the education that we are now providing, and this is a point I think Gary made, it's obsolete. I mean, it isn't just obsolete, it's dysfunctional. You know, the old hippie thing used to be, well, you're taking good, smart people and turning them into machines, which was never true. You were just taking them off pot, which may have had something. But the reality is that right now, we're taking people that need to be taught to be agile and flexible and think differently, and we're teaching them the same old BS. Now, admittedly, it's only been a couple of months, but man, you got to move fast or you're roadkill. And our educational system right now is basically teaching people how to be roadkill.
Well, I think, you know, this gives me a chance to sort of say what I wanted to say on my last slide. I think you're right, but there are two things that maybe every education department, you know, every department needs to be training, or maybe we should start morphing, I'm not sure. But there are two skills that are going to be really important, and they're quite different. One, the one I was sort of labeling as philosophy, is the set of knowledge that allows people to effectively make arguments about priorities and to try to convince others that something should be a higher social priority than another. But then the other thing, and Brad, you mentioned that with these complex systems, no one really even knows what's going on. And so I'd say the other skill is going to be basically rigorous social sciences like economics or sociology, where we build skills to understand what, you know, how we know things and what we can know and how to measure things and how to understand causal relationships. And those, I think, are going to be enduring, and so we need to start building those into every program, basically.
And maybe just to kind of follow up on that too, Jane, we as an industry are really bad at change management, and so I think that to follow up on that, really change management skills is sort of what is needed. How are we being agile? How are we adopting? How are we implementing? How are we vetting? And then how are we training the humans to adapt to those various functions, right? Change management is so problematic and something that we just don't teach anywhere.
So I'm going to move to a different topic, not because we couldn't talk about this one for a few hours or a few days. But Leah, you, in your presentation, you challenged the rights that people had in terms of the copyrights or property rights they had in terms of their creations. And there's a big conversation going on as to should there be some remuneration, for example, for creative artists whose images are getting ripped off and reconstructed and reassembled in Dolly, for example, as one of the programs. Do you think that conversation has much validity, or that's just not the way to talk about you know, whether people have any rights or should have any compensation?
So I had my copyright students this semester analyze an AI-related problem. Imagine you're Microsoft, you're considering this purchase, you're considering investing. Is this fair use? Are they likely to win or lose in court? The conclusion was overwhelmingly that it flies successfully in fair use. That's also what I saw. They have these online markets where people can bid to predict legal outcomes, so it's distributed prediction. It's relatively accurate, and it's my own sense. I think the legal system moves slowly enough that by the time the court gets close to deciding this, I think everyone will have decided that it was a stupid question to have asked. I think we're moving towards a post-scarcity world for art and text,
Good enough.
in which we'll stop expecting to be paid.
Let's presume that fair use, that it passes in fair use, which brings us to the broader question. If we are upsetting the employment apple cart, at least for a large segment of the society, even if it may not affect any of us or our children, because we're going to adapt and get the higher end new jobs that are being created, what should our societies be doing as far as the distribution of goods and services? It's very clear. I mean, there's so many different charts on this about how the top 10%'s wealth has increased by trillions of dollars, while the bottom 50% has decreased by perhaps as much as $1 trillion over, I mean, the different periods that we can talk about. I don't want to get into that. But I think it's pretty clear that the flow of capital is not to everyone. And so what should we as a society be doing if generative AI may be part of what exacerbates this distribution problem? What should we do as a society in terms of distributing goods and services if wages is no longer a reliable way to do so?
I have a few thoughts. So I think we're allowing ourselves to get a little bit sci-fi here, that we're talking about in the, we're not sure how far in the future entire industries will be destroyed. But we saw the internet do that to some industries, and so now we can imagine that happening in multiple industries at once. I think having more leisure time, so if we solve the income problem, having more leisure time is probably good. The income problem, I mean, I do think that that Andrew Yang's campaign on universal basic income came a little too early. That I think if we were campaigning today, people might take it a little more seriously. And the usual counter argument to some kind of mass wealth redistribution. And call it a welfare system, but I know that word raises problems. I think the usual argument against it is that we get value from work, but I think if we tried to prepare people to add value to society without having their income be tagged to that, and instead having some sort of, getting that sense of use, sense of being useful to others through some other mechanism other than the price, right? That could be, that's the sort of most positive, I think, version of how things could play out. I could also imagine a lot of negative ones, so.
And I
I'm
think,
going to let just Brad, weigh in on this, and then I just wanted to wave a flag at this subject because we all know this is another massive subject, and there's all kinds of questions around guaranteed income and so forth. But Brad, sure, weigh in.
yeah, no, I was just going to say that I think it makes sense to look at two issues, distribution and production, separately. Production is clearly moving towards a star system, and so far wages have done that. That's not new. That's been happening for 20 years. Back when I was with AT&T, you could see the shift in salaries going more and more to the more productive people because you could identify them and because the differences in production became really significant. And that was interesting at AT&T because AT&T was one of those companies where if you served your time, you'd get promoted, yada, 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 like IBM was. So that system has been going on for a while, and the question of distribution of resources in some ways is a separate one from how you produce that which is going to be redistributed to begin with.
Right.
I'm not.
Question.
Yeah, I'm not sure ChatGPT is going to really significantly change what we decide to do with distribution. Hopefully, it'll give us more to distribute.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's not going to decide what we do in distribution, but it's pretty clear also, I would say more than 20 years. There's at least charts showing that over the last 50 years in both Europe and America, productivity gains have been going more and more toward the owners of capital and away from wages. So I mean, it's a pretty profound problem. But again, we aren't going to go down all these rabbit holes here. This was just by way of flagging that the generative AI debate is going to touch every aspect of our society. Now, whether it will be short-lived, the way much of what happened with the deep learning or machine learning debate, or whether it's going to have a dramatic impact very quickly, I don't think anybody can quite predict that at the moment, and we'll see what happens over the next couple of years. But I want to open this up to everyone, and I'm going to give you slightly...
has one more.
Oh, okay.
Oh, I am not sure, my understanding from, like, I think his name is Markovitz's meritocracy trap, is that it's not really the case that having capital is the way to accumulate wealth, that we do have these, the people who work the hardest are really getting rich today. And so I just wanted to, I think it's not as simple as, those who are already wealthy will continue to be wealthy. Okay, sorry.
Yeah. That's fine. So I'm going to give you slightly different charges than usually when we open this up, because usually we open it up to just questions from the audience, and if you get into speeches, we try and cut them off. But I think this is a slightly different topic where some of you have some seminal insights. So I would say if you can keep it down to 30 to 45 seconds, you can make a point and not just ask the questions. So Jay.
The reflection on whether the changes the technology may bring to legal work may reduce the number of lawyers that are needed in the United States. I think it's an interesting one, but it's been a fairly America-centric conversation so far. America has the highest per capita number of lawyers in the world, and most of the world looks in horror at how litigious we are, and the two may be related. But one of the things I think you might want to reflect on is the degree to which these technologies may then expand and democratize access to legal services throughout the world, which I don't think very many people think about.
Anybody want to respond to that, or shall we?
Can I?
Yeah, please.
I want to broaden the insight too, which is that I think we have a tendency to do a lot of thinking about the bad things that could happen because of AI, and have not had enough discussion yet of what are our top priorities to solve that we would like to direct AI towards solving, right? Government can invest, in a particular direction, say, we're going to pour a bunch of money into using AI to solve global warming, or we're going to pour a bunch of money into using AI to, I don't know, global warming seems like it belongs in the top 3.
Any other questions or points out there, please?
My uncle called me the other day and said, can you write me a business plan? I have a business idea. And I told him that I couldn't do that. What I could do is establish the forms that need to form your company, for example, the articles of incorporation, the bylaws, stuff like that. And then once you start the company, you can, have a business plan according to your needs as you go forward. And I think that's the situation that's going on here.
Mm-hmm. Josh, you had a point.
Yeah, so if very rapidly changing conditions tend to select for adaptability, as you suggest, what does that suggest about, if we look at where do we find adaptability, or more specifically, where in the population or across demographics do we find a lack of adaptability? And how closely is that lack of adaptability correlated with, say, political or economic power, right? What does that suggest about the stability of our institutions over the next couple decades?
Well, I think you answered your own question. It suggests that they are highly unstable, which I think you can see already, right? Virtually across Europe and the US, you've seen all of these responses to just chat AI talking about, regulation or banning or this, that, and the other. Once it becomes clear that it has a differential effect on success, that's going to be even worse. But it raises, I think, a fundamental issue with AI, which is dangerous and does need to be addressed, and that is that we're going to move into an economy that selects for agility, adaptability, high cognitive functioning, and it's going to be not everybody who can come up to that standard, which means that if we keep with the star system, which is what we have today, you reward the people that are most productive, we're going to end up with a very skewed society. It turns out that the tech bros have already been thinking about this, and if you read Wired, one of their solutions is that you bring in enough AI-based bread and circuses that you can buy the masses off, because, boy, they're going to be pissed.
High functioning, but also maybe high risk.
High risk, high functioning, and I mean, it's like the old argument about CBI, or the universal basic income. It's a good idea, but everybody was saying, and then we'll all go out and write poems. How many people want to write poems? So you're dealing with the possibility that you're going to end up with a very large, dissatisfied proletariat. And I think we have no idea how to handle that. If it happens, these are scenarios.
And in America, a good number of them own guns.
They all own guns.
Yes, go ahead. Can you speak up a bit, please?
Or Josh. I guess this is more of a comment, but doesn't that say that as part of training lawyers and other professions, do we need to start taking into account that these skills about flexibility and adaptability need to be tested at a young age? Is that going to form a meritocracy through the school system when you start having people at young ages test their kids for flexibility and adaptability and get private tutors? How do you address all of those kind of impacts?
So there are individual questions I think are a little bit easier to answer, right? What's good for my students? Less rote work, less writing skills, more different types of challenges, soft skills, interpersonal interaction, problem solving. I think maybe I want to put my kids, send them back to kindergarten again, right? That's probably where they would learn the most. The societal question is a totally different one, right? We may not. Do we need a superstar system of productivity? Might be great as long as we're moving the money around. That's a choice to make, right? What I feel more comfortable predicting is that just as with agriculture and industry and electrification and the computer industry, this technology will drive huge new productivity gains, which gives us the opportunity to have more to redistribute. And the historical trend information also that I've seen is over time, just massive reductions in the lowest levels of poverty, that economic growth of any sort, even if you think it's very top imbalanced, dramatically lifts the standard of living at the bottom. So that's the main reason that I'm optimistic that at the end of the day, the benefits outweigh, because I feel very confident saying we'll have productivity growth, and in the past, it trickles down, not perfectly.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And in fact, even though a minute ago I do embrace something like a universal basic income, I do think we need to make sure not to reduce the incentives too much for those stars to go be stars and go boost productivity as much as they currently do. But I also think, in terms of what People, I do think some people are just sort of constitutionally risk averse, not adaptable. But I think there is still room. I mean, some of the wealthiest cities today also have flourishing artisan cultures where, we now want, handmade items. I think it's hard to predict, but that there will be plenty of things for people to do without having to be part of this massive AI economy.
Sir.
Yeah, some of the recent economic work shows we've already been taking into account this problem of different levels of disposable income. So the bottom 20% of Americans now has average disposable income of just over $49,000 a year. The top 20% has disposable income because of much higher taxes of just around $200,000. So the disparity is really like 4 to 1. It's not as great as a lot of people have reported.
When you start to think internationally, the disparity is
but even if you're in the bottom 20% at $49,000, that puts you in the top 15% of world disposable income.
And whatever that glass shaped, reverse champagne glass, there's also an element to which it's the rising tide lifting boats. And that's the number one panic that I have when I think people say, let's wait 6 months, or let's put on the brakes, or let's try to slow this down, is that loss of growth compounded over time will dramatically increase poverty 10 years, 20, 50 years from now.
I had recognized somebody who I thought was in that back corner, but.
Is there someone up here?
It's not, are they gone back? Okay, that's fine. Well,
Thank you.
There'll be two
Thank you very
questions,
much.
one here and one there, and unfortunately, our time, I believe, is running down.
All right, thank you so much for the panel and the provocative conversation. I have a question about the impact of this technology, and particularly GPT, language-based generative AI. And my question is about its impact upon humans' ability to create knowledge and expertise. So if, for example, the analogy of smartphones is, that's a device where I offload my memory, and it affects memory capacity is what I think the science has shown. But if something like ChatGPT, I then offload my capacity to analyze syntax and derive meaning from written words, what does that do to me or to others about their ability to create knowledge and then create this expertise that will differentiate us from the machine?
So I think the interesting question is, do you differentiate yourself from the machine? I think that the structure of AI and the broader technology systems underneath it, things like smartphones, indicates that what we're doing is we're creating techno-human cognitive structures that operate above the level of the individual. This is something that, for example, the militaries of leading countries are trying to figure out, because if they're going to succeed in high technology conflicts, they're going to have to be able to think cognitively at levels that are far above the individual. And I think that particularly for people such as in this room, that's going to be part of the way that we increase our productivity. It's not going to be that I'm going to be thinking all of the things that I could have thought. It's going to be that the way I interact with the technology creates cognitive product that can be used across networks in ways that I could never predict or even imagine. So I think, we've said this before, but we really do live in a science fiction world. And part of that world is that all those Cartesian ideas we had about the sanctity of the individual cognitive structure, that's gone. Because if we're really going to be effective, we need to be able to think in these techno-human networks. And that's an entirely different way of thinking.
But there's a question about whether that's going to be a meaningful world for most people.
Whether it's a meaningful world depends on how you choose to produce your meaning, right? I mean, the human is still responsible for their sense of meaning.
They may be, but I mean, the point is, are a significant portion of human beings going to feel demeaned or feel that their dignity has been taken away from them? I don't think we have to go down this rabbit hole. I'm just trying to flag different rabbit holes that are tied to
I don't want to lose the
conversation.
thread of what
Please.
you were just saying there. I want to make sure I understand it right. So right now, all of us can only rent Brad for about an hour at a time, right? But soon there will be.
That depends on how much you're willing to pay.
But you're envisioning a future in which there will be a Brad app, right? And a Leah app and a Taylor Swift app. I don't know why her, right? And I can choose from the playlist of whoever's brain I want to borrow. And we can all, millions of us can be doing that at the same time and attaching it to different tasks.
And at the same time, you'll have AI structures that will be integrating your cognition with others to create cognitive product that operates above the level of the individual.
Yeah.
So you'll be drawing it down, but at the same time, it'll be operating above the level of the individual. Because individual cognition is essentially going to become obsolete at the high end. And what's going to count is your ability to integrate across these networks. That's already happening in the military.
Good prompting.
So,
Good prompting is part of it, absolutely.
So we did say that one other person was going to get a chance to ask a question or make a statement, so please.
Okay, so I want to apologize in advance if this was already spoken about. I came in a little late. But I'm wondering whether or not it's relevant as to whether or not the foundational model that the ChatGPT is based on and the LLM is based on, which also includes DALL-E and which also includes chemical analysis, whatever else OpenAI is working on, what is the relevance of the potential that OpenAI is actually perhaps stumbled upon AGI or something very close to AGI? Is that a bigger conversation, whether or not that approximates some form of consciousness or something like that? But yeah. I've heard various people in the computer science community essentially suggest that OpenAI has come close to AGI.
Yeah, I think OpenAI isn't anywhere close to AGI, but that, again, depends on how you want to define the terms. But I think what you're pointing to and how I'm going to finish this conversation up.
No, let Chitta weigh in.
Oh, please, Chitta, go ahead. I was trying to just bring it to the end since
I agree what Wallach was saying. We still issues to be solved, and I'm also, what exactly is consciousness? There's still a question about that. And something else to point to the other person, the one question before that I wanted to say is today, every year there are like 1 million articles on cancer. No researcher is able to read them. So in many scientific research areas, this is one example, this technology will be very helpful trying to connect things and find gaps and address some of the scientific research. So it will be very helpful in many scientific research things. Thank you.
So this was a pretty wild conversation we had here. But, perhaps I was a little heavy-handed, but I think it was intentional on my part that we have this kind of conversation because it's a way of just appreciating how entangled generative AI is in a massive number of major issues that we are confronted with today. It's about governance, it's about living in a world of complex adaptive systems, it's about whether technology can have semantic understanding and will really compete with us. These are all topics we didn't even really touch upon in our conversation. So thank you very much. I found it enlightening just that we did this, and I hope it was of value to all of you, and thank you to our panelists.
Thank you, everyone. All right, we got a little break, but